So I've just come into a new file here, and I've gone up to our little S. I've come into my new template, and if you don't have this guy, just look in the description for the tutorial where we cover creating our own templates. And then I've just named our graph snow, and I've gone ahead and clicked OK. And I want to do a little bit of setup before we start. So I'm going to right click and drag and drop this base material into our viewport. So we're starting to use this to visualize what's going on. And then I want to come into materials, default, and edit. And I want to come over to our height and bring the scale all the way up. And this is just going to allow us to view our height map on our material here. And so now that we've done that, we're ready to start the material. So the first thing I want to do for our materials, I want to start by creating some of the little snow pockets that we're going to get on our material here. So I'm going to start with a Swells 1, and I'm just going to drag this guy into our height and our normals. And you can see now that we're starting to see our height map on our material here. And it's kind of looking like a little bit like a ball pit, really. And we're going to be using these kind of like puffs, and we're going to invert them to make them look more like they're recessed into our geometry. But we're not going to do that just yet because I want to vary the scale of this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, or Control D, this guy, to duplicate. If I come in here, and I'm going to blend these two together. And I'm just going to shift and click to steal that guy. And so we're not going to notice any difference because, one, we have no difference between these two nodes, and we're not viewing the bottom node because we're not blending between the layers. So I'm going to add a Gaussian noise first because I want to blend between our cells layers. And I'm going to add a levels node on top of this just so that we can fine tune the masking opacity between these two. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the bottom node here is just scaled up because I want to get a little bit of a difference, and I'm going to play around with the disorder as well just to randomly move those around. I'm also going to make sure that our top one here is a little bit smaller too, or larger, I guess, smaller scale, larger size, so that we're getting something kind of like that. And you can see now the masking is not too great because we've got such large, or sorry, small noise, and they're not very contrasted. So I'm going to decrease our scale so that we get some larger forms. Again, playing around with the disorder a little bit. And I'm going to use our levels node to just crank up our contrast. And that's looking pretty good. Something like that, where we've got some larger pockets and then some more smaller scale pockets. So that's pretty good. So I'm going to bring these guys back. And now I want to invert these like I was saying earlier. So I'm going to go on to our blend, and I'm going to add a curve. And the curve is going to allow us to kind of manipulate the gradient from our blackest value to our whitest value. And you can see if I double click on this line here and start to play around with it, I can change a lot of the effects of the curve. You can see if I make this a little bit sharper of a fall off into a more plateau, we get this weird little mound look. So I'm going to bring this back into the center. And I'm actually going to take these handles and I'm going to invert it so that our slope or our curve is going this way. Because what I want to do is I want to invert our darkest values to be our highest values and our highest values to be our darkest values. So you can see if I go into the bottom corner here and I bring this is our darkest value in our gradient so far. So if I slide this all the way up, you can see now the dark values are going to be our whitest values. And if we look in here, you can see that they've started to pretty much peak. And if I go to our lighter values and I slide those down, now all of a sudden they're going to be our darkest values. And so we're going to use this as kind of our base for our snow, just to get some like nice slow snow clumps and just kind of push things around. I'm also going to play around with our middle piece here to maybe just round up the top a little bit so that it's not just a sharp point, but there's a little bit of, if we look in here, a little bit more build up. And you can see if I bring this guy down, we're going to have a more sharp point. And if I bring this up, we're going to have a little bit more rounded at the top there. And that's more the look that we want. And so the last thing I want to do is I want to start by creating some noise on these straight lines. They're a little too straight for my liking, and they don't really look like snow at this point. They look more like kind of like a steel material or something like that, you know, dented steel. I don't know the actual term for it, but that's kind of what it's looking like right now. So I want to noise that up a little bit. And how we're going to do that is I'm going to add a directional warp, and I'm going to add a clouds 1 node. And you can see with the clouds 1 that we've got a lot of noise to work with here, but it's kind of smooth in some areas, and that's what we want. We don't want our noise to be too static, too noisy. We want to have a little bit smoother areas. So if I bring this guy into our directional warp, you can see now we're going to get a little bit more buildup of the snow, but it still looks relatively soft. And we can even play around with the disorder of the snow, or sorry, of the clouds. Play around with the scale, although I wouldn't recommend it just because it gets a lot noisier the smaller the scale. And we can even play around with the intensity and the warp angle of our directional warp. And so for now, I'm just going to leave it because I like it as it is. And I'm thinking that maybe we have too many small pockets right now. So I'm going to come back to our cells here, and I might just decrease the scale by 1 or 2. And I think I just, oh no, I didn't bring it back. Okay, so we'll go about 14, we'll say. I might change that later, but for now we'll do 14. Okay, and so we've got our snow pockets done. And now I want to go ahead and start creating some wind effects, kind of like our snow has been blown back and forth. And so we're getting some nice streaks along our kind of like little squalls here. But I want to make sure that the snow streaks kind of follow a bit of the contour of our pockets here, so that it isn't just kind of straight across, but it kind of follows the geometry. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create directional scratches. And we're going to use these as our streaks. So I'm going to bring down the scale so that we get some larger ones to start with. And I'm going to bring the pattern amount down to about 0.5, just so that we have a little bit less, so we've got more contrast in certain areas. And next I'm going to add a directional blur. And I'm just going to crank this up to something like 100, just so that we get some nice blurry and straighter lines. You can see here there's a little bit of a fall off, and I just want to stretch those out and kind of blur them a little bit so they're a little bit less contrasted. And so what I want to do with those is I want to warp those across our geometry. And a good node for that is the vector, if I click correctly, the vector warp grayscale. And so you can see that it's got an input and a vector map. And one is grayscale and one is color information. And so we're going to plug in our directional blur because that's what we want to vector warp. And we're going to use our baseline geometry here for our vector map. And so you can see that we're going to get a red connection because we're taking a grayscale into a color input. And so we need to make this directional warp a color input. So I'm going to make it a gradient map. And you can see that we're going to get our color information linking directly into our vector warp. And what the vector warp is going to take is a vector map. And a vector map is traditionally kind of an orange to green gradient. And you can see when we go into our gradient editor here, I'm going to make our lightest value an orange, kind of like a neon orange. And I'm going to make our darkest value kind of like a neon green. And this is traditionally what a vector map kind of looks like, with this gradient from green to orange. And you can see how this is going to affect our lines. So if I decrease this intensity, we go from these straight lines, and they kind of warp around our geometry. So now I want to add these over top of our base height map here. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to take a slope blur grayscale, and I'm going to plug our vector map into the slope aspect of it. And I'm going to shift click this guy here, plug that into the output. And then I'm going to click this guy and make sure that we make that connection. And you can see that it's immediately going to ruin everything we've done. And that's a pretty classic slope blur tactic here. They try and dupe you. So we're going to increase our samples up, make it look nice and still pretty bad. And then we're going to really decrease the intensity. So we're starting to get some semblance of what we once had. And now that's a little bit too jaggedy. And I want to go down to our mode. And I'm going to go to min. I'm going to stay on min. And so I think that's a little bit too noisy still. So I might can decrease the amount, and just playing around with these to kind of see what you like. And I think that maybe around 0.1 on the pattern. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So this is still a little bit too noisy in certain areas, and you can see down here, like that's a little bit too jaggedy for what snow is going to look like. So once we've got this to a nice kind of baseline that we like, we're just going to run this through a blur high quality grayscale. And we're just going to blur everything down, bring up the quality and bringing the intensity down. Just so that we can kind of get a little bit softer of a feel to it. And I'm going to stick with something like 0.8 for now. Yeah, that's looking okay. Next, what I want to do is I want to introduce some variation into the height of certain regions of our material. Because right now it's all pretty uniform, and you can see here, like it still kind of looks procedural. So I want to introduce some varying height angles. And so all we're going to do for that is I'm going to have a blend node on top of this. And I'm going to bring a Gaussian, if I can spell it right, a Gaussian noise. And I'm going to plug that guy in. And you can see how we're going to use this for our height variation, because we've got a lot of different noise going on here. And now that's a little bit too small. So I'm going to bring that up and play around with the disorder a little bit. And we're going to use this height information to blend over top of our blur here. And it's just going to give us some varying height information. So I want to take this in our blend and I want to go down to overlay. And you can see now it's kind of flattening out some areas while leaving other areas relatively more intact. And this is just going to help sell the effect of kind of random snow being blown around and Mother Nature and all that. And again, you can play around with this using the disorder if you don't like how it's kind of shifting. And that's looking pretty cool. Now the last thing I want to do with this, move all this over here. And I want to make sure that kind of the lower areas of our snow here, kind of the middle of these pockets, don't have as much noise, because if the wind is sweeping over it, it's only kind of collecting the top and kind of blowing by the bottoms of this snow. And so what we're going to do for that is we're going to add a non-uniform blur grayscale. And so we're going to take our height here and bring that into the grayscale. I'm going to shift click again to just steal this. And so right now, what it's going to do is nothing, because we don't have any blur map input into our non-uniform blur. And so what a blur map is it's just a grayscale, black and white map of the areas that we want to blur off. So it's not going to blur our entire image. It's only going to blur the areas that we want it to. And so white areas in a blur map indicate areas you want to blur. Black areas indicate areas you do not want to blur. And how are we going to select the lower areas of our material while keeping the higher areas or the less recessed areas more noisier? Yeah, that's English. We're going to use a histogram select, and this is going to allow us to select a certain range on our gradients to kind of just visualize for our blur map here. And you can see that immediately we're going to get this weird looking thing. And if we scrub through the position, you can see that we're selecting different areas along the range. And if I bring the position down, you can see that we're going to be selecting all of the darker areas. And these areas are the areas we want to select because they're the more recessed. So if I bring this output into our non-uniform blur, just so that we can visualize it, you can see what we're doing as we scroll up and down our blur. And so I'm going to bring our position all the way to the bottom because I want to select the bottom of our gradient, or the darkest value. And then we can play around with the range, and the range is going to just, like it says, increase or decrease the range of our selection. So I'm going to bring that up to something like, we'll do 0.1. And again, you can play around with the contrast. However, that's going to look very, very odd, as it's going to be very, very contrasted. And it's not going to work for this material. So I'm going to leave that contrast down at 0. And now I want to go into our non-uniform blur here, and I want to play around with this. So you can increase the intensity of your blur, except that's going to give us a little bit of over blurred results to the point where it's actually kind of worked against what we wanted to do. So I'm going to leave that on 10. You can even decrease it maybe a little bit. And maybe we'll do something like 5, just to kind of blend in a little bit nicer. You can play around with the anisotropy, and what that does is if we crank that up, you can kind of see these little tiny streaks coming in. If I bring that down and bring that up, that's just going to help sell that a nice little windswept effect. Like we're still getting some wind sweeping, but it's not as rigid and tough as it is over here. And I might bring that down to something like 0.9, just not as visible. And asymmetry, what asymmetry is going to do is if we crank this all the way up, it's basically going to have one side kind of tucked over the blur and one side tucked under. And And you can see if I bring this down, the shift that it's going to do is it's just going to kind of shift our deeper areas into one kind of pocket or one direction. And you can even play around with this. And so it is kind of handy depending on what kind of look you're going for. So I'm going to bring this back to 0. And I'm going to bring this to about 0.5. Just so that we get some more, again, wind direction coming into our material. We can also play around with the samples, increase those up. And we can play around with the blades and increase those up just to get a better quality. And so that's starting to look pretty cool. Okay, and so now the first thing I want to do is I want to go in and play around with our blur a little bit more, because I think this is a little bit too sharp now after we've blurred our recessed areas. So I'm going to come back in here to our blur. And let's see what 1.5 looks like. Yeah, that's maybe a little bit too blurred, so let's try 1. Maybe 1.25. And yeah, something like that is looking a little bit better. And now I just kind of want to come in here to our uniform, maybe play around with the anisotropy back to 0.1. And yeah, that's looking a little bit better. So we're going to stick with that moving forward. And we're going to go into the next thing, which is kind of adding a little bit more of a transitional piece between these peak areas and the blurred areas. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another directional, man, I cannot spell, directional scratches. I'm going to bring everything back a little bit. And I'm going to bring in a directional scratches. And just like we did for these kind of windswept peaks, we're going to do kind of the same thing where we're adding some more kind of directional information. So I'm going to bring the scale all the way down again. I'm going to bring the pattern amount down half. And I'm going to bring this through a warp node, because I want to kind of just add some waviness to these lines, and I'm going to bring it through, bring in a Gaussian noise. We're going to use this to kind of warp our lines a little bit. So I'm going to bring the intensity way down to kind of something like that. I'll go 0.25. And now again, we want to warp these lines across our geometry here. So we're going to do the same thing with a vector map and a vector warp grayscale node. So I'm going to add another vector warp grayscale. Bring that guy in the top there. And I'm going to just Control D this guy back here because we already have created a vector map. Except this time I want to make sure we plug in the last node or height information that we have for our geometry so that it's kind of the most up-to-date geometry that it's blending around. So I'm going to take this guy here and plug that in. And you can see now what it's going to do is it's going to just do the exact same thing where it's going to warp around our geometry here. So I'm going to take these guys and just tuck them real close. And I want to, again, just blend these over top of our height information. So I'm going to blend, bring that guy in, steal these, making sure that we still connect that guy there. And I'm going to bring this in over top. And immediately it's going to, again, destroy all of our information because we're just viewing this guy up top over here. But if I go into our blending mode and I just kind of scroll down, I want to go to multiply. And multiply is going to allow us to remove any of the lighter values and just basically add the darker values. So I'm going to really decrease the opacity there. So we're going to get some kind of like windswept again line information. And so that's looking pretty cool, but now it's starting to look like a topographical map. And so we don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another non-uniform blur grayscale node. And I'm going to add another histogram select. And this time I'm going to plug in this height into our histogram select. And I'm going to plug this guy into our blur here. And so now I want to basically work the inverse from our top here down towards the darkest value. And we're basically going to blur the top so that we're not going to get any of that line information that we just added. So I'm going to go position to max, and I'm going to increase our range. So it's going to start to kind of peel away some of that so that we're going to get more of that line information down there. And so I'm not really liking just kind of how it's looking so far. So I'm going to come back in. And the scale's a little bit too noisy. I might come down and decrease the pattern amount. Just so that we're getting something. And that's starting to look a little bit better. We're getting a little bit more kind of noise around there, just around the edges. And it's very, very minute detail. But again, it's just something to add to the realism or sell the effect of the material. So now that we've created the snow material or the snow pattern for our material, I'm going to go ahead and start creating the rocks that we're going to use to scatter around our snow. So I'm going to bring this on down here, and I'm going to start by adding a shape node. And I want to come over to our pattern, and I want to bring it down to paraboloid because we're going to be using this as the basis for our rocks. And so I'm going to use a little bit of a more efficient technique where I'm going to tile this 4 times. I'm going to bring the scale down a little bit. And so we're going to manipulate this shape node in a way that we're going to basically have 4 unique rock textures here, or rock height stamps, that we're going to be able to use as 4 separate rock inputs, but we're only going to affect them via one chain. And you're going to see here in a second how this is kind of handy and pretty efficient for memory. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start by differentiating the actual rock patterns themselves. So I'm going to add a polygon 2 node, and I want to blend these two together. And I want to blend them with a subtract. And you can see that because we've got this pattern in the middle, it's going to kind of subtract from all of them equally. And so I'm going to add a transformation 2D node, and we're going to allow us to kind of manipulate or move this around to subtract from these different rocks. But I'm not done with the polygon yet because I want to decrease the gradient so we get more subtraction to work with. And I'm going to kind of decrease the curve a little bit so that we're going to get some rounded cuts. So now if I click on our blend, you can see that we're getting those rounded cuts, and it's cut away more of the material because we have such a flat face. So I'm going to just click on our transformation, and I'm going to start to bring this around and start manipulating it so that we're going to get some nice rock cuts. And so I kind of like something like that. It's something simple, something easy. Actually, these two look a little bit too similar. So something like that. It's just simple and easy, but it started off our shapes here, and you can see that we're getting some nice rounded cuts. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add some cracks through these rocks, again, to just kind of differentiate them. So what I want to do with that is I'm going to add a tile random. And this allows us to basically, like a tile sampler, just sample a bunch of different tiles, but we get to randomly splatter them around. And so I'm going to go to paraboloid, because this is going to give us a bunch of different circles. And I want to increase the scale to, I'll start at 5 and just kind of slowly peel away from it. I also want to make sure that we're not on the add blending mode if we come down to the bottom, but on max, so that we get these nice kind of darker cracks in between the two. And play around with the scale random a little bit. And I'm also going to play around with the rotation random. Just so that we're getting a bunch of different and random kind of lines here. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an edge detect. And this is going to allow me to detect all of those darker values and assign them kind of to a binary color value or a grayscale value, so that we can use these to basically crack away at the rocks. So we can play around with the edge roundness a little bit. Maybe bring the edge width down. And so now I want to kind of randomize this a little bit more and add some more directional warp to it, so that it's not just a straight crack, because that really does not look natural. It looks very artificial. So for this, I'm going to add a clouds 2 node, and I'm just going to plug that into our directional warp. And you can see it's going to kind of bring around some of the rock cracks, just so that they're not so straight. You can play around with the rotation of it. You can play around with the intensity of it. I might do something like 12 just to have a little bit more jaggediness, but I don't want to have too much, because you can see that if you do that, you're going to get some kind of weird blowout. So I like that to just be like that. I also added a little bit more kind of noise to mine by just adding a slope blur and a Gaussian noise. Again, you don't have to do this, but I think it just added a little bit more to it. If I bring this down to min, you can see that we're getting some cut away from different areas, so that it's not just a straight crack. And again, you can play around with the disorder of this, play around with the scale of it. And I think that's pretty cool. So now I'm going to bring these guys over. And I want to blend these two together. So I'm going to blend and bring these in. And I want to hit multiply. And so multiply is going to remove any of the white values from the top texture and just keep the darker values from down here. And so now looking at these, they're a little bit too cracked, a little too fractured. So I can come back to our tile here, just decrease the amount so that we're getting larger tiles. And something like that looks cool, so that we got some unique cracking going on. I really like this one here, where it kind of all stems from one area, and that's looking pretty cool. So I want to come back into our blend, just because when we visualize this, this is going to be a very, very harsh contrast for the cracks. So much so that it's going to go pretty much to the peak, and then it's going to drop right down to the black, the surrounding. So I just want to decrease the opacity very lightly to about 0.25. And this is probably going to give us kind of an okay effect. Let's take a look if we just steal this guy here and plug that in and see what that looks like. And that's not too bad. We could even maybe just decrease it to about 0.15. And that's starting to look pretty good. So I'm going to just pop that guy back in there. Actually, you know what? Let's just keep that in our rocks here, because we're going to want to see these guys in real time, see what they look like. So now I want to start adding some edge damage to these so that they're not looking, you know, nice and straight. I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. And I'm going to add a Gaussian noise. So I want to ramp up our samples, decrease the intensity, you know, the same old, same old. And I'm going to go to min. And this is going to allow us to kind of just take away from the rocks a little bit. We can play around with the scale too. And that's just going to cut away, give us some nice initial damage. And I'm having a hard time seeing this. So I'm going to go to environment and edit. And I'm going to go 0.5. Actually, I might even go just click on 1 just to increase the exposure a little bit so we can see this a little bit nicer. So we've got that all situated. And so the next thing I want to do is I want to bring it through another slope blur. And we're just going to continuously add a few slope blurs so that we can kind of just incrementally increase the damage of these rocks. And so I'm going to add a fractal sum base and plug that guy in. I'm going to, in the fractal sum, going to decrease the max levels. You can play around with the roughness a little bit. Maybe leave that like that. Play around with the intensity a little bit. And I'm going to leave the samples relatively low. So if I crank them up, actually there's not too much of an effect on that one. So I'm gonna, yeah, you can crank those up. It's just gonna help kind of bleed the rock into the ground a little bit more so that it's not just this kind of straight cutoff like we have over here. Again, I'm gonna add another slope blur. I'm just going to Control D this. Bring the intensity way down. Maybe bring the max level and the min level up a little bit. And you can just really decrease the intensity. We might, let's see if we leave this on blur. Now we'll bring this on to min again. Now I want to make sure that we bring this all the way down, just nice and light. You can play around with the roughness. Just some subtle surfacing effects there. That's looking pretty cool. And so now we've completed our rocks, but how are we going to isolate them so that we can plug them into a tile sampler? Well, that's pretty easy. First, I'm going to add a tile sampler node, and I'm going to set this up to accept our pattern, and it's going to accept 4 inputs. And you can see here we're going to get pattern 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm just going to plug this in to each one of those guys. And you can see that each pattern is going to consist of those 4 rocks. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to, first of all, shift click this so that's not in the way. And I'm going to take one of our connections there and I'm going to add a transformation 2D. And I'm going to do that for all of our connections here. So now that we've got everything connected, we can go into our top node here. And all we're going to do is we're just going to increase this and bump this guy right up. so that we get a nice large image of this rock. We want to make sure that's not getting cut off and it's not tiling over top of itself so that we're getting another rock coming in. And so that's looking pretty cool, and you can see that it's showing up much nicer in our material than these other rocks. And so I'm just going to do the exact same with this guy, just making sure to stretch him out to a nice, just a nice area covering most of the texture here. And so I'm going to do that with the other two and just kind of skip ahead until I'm done. All right, and so we've got all of those completed, and so we've got all of our rocks just kind of tiling randomly. And we've done all of these 4 different stones, all from one simple shape node. And you can see how that's pretty effective, is that all we need to do is kind of create a bunch of different variations off of one node here, and we can simply create a ton of different rocks that we can use. And all we have to do to affect all our rocks is simply add one node to the chain, and it will affect the same effect across all of our stones. So that's pretty handy to work this way. So now that we've got that, I want to go ahead and I want to start by creating these large scale rocks. And we're going to start with the huge big rocks that you saw in the material, because it's much easier to work from big to small than it is from small to big. So I'm going to go into our tile here, and I'm going to really decrease the amount that we have to about 4 by 4. This is going to get some nice good size rocks. I'm going to come down to our size. We can scale the random a little bit, but I don't want to do it too random because we are going to be adding multiple tile samplers for specific kind of large, mid, and small sized rocks. So be a little bit careful when you're doing the scale random so that you're not getting, you know, kind of tiny rocks like this, unless you're trying to do all of your rock work in one tile sampler. I'm going to increase the size of this as well. I want to bring around the position random a little bit, and the rotation random as well. And so now here, I just want to start by masking off some of them randomly, because I want to have just a few larger rocks in our scene, and that's maybe even a little too much. Yeah, kind of something like that's pretty cool. So I might go back up to our scale. I might just increase those a little bit. Maybe play around with the position random again. And then maybe come back down to our mask random just to see what we can get. Yeah, that looks a little too uniform still. Maybe something like that for now. We might change this in the future, but that's the nice thing about Designer, is that we can make these changes. And as long as we make our material flexible enough, it should all just work. So now I want to go ahead and I want to start creating a mid to low sized tile sampler for our rocks. So I'm just going to Control D this guy here, because I still want to use the same rocks, except for this guy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to significantly increase the amount. I'm just going to visualize this. And I'm probably going to go about 20 and 20, just so that we get a lot of them. And I want to come down, again, playing around with the scale, playing around with our, let's see here, rotation random. Now, right now, I'm going to bring our mask random all the way down, because what I want to do is I want to make sure these rocks don't intersect with the large rocks that we've created. And there's a way that we can do that using our tile samplers. and that's going to be in our mask map here. So we're going to be able to plug in a mask that when we come into our pattern here, if we scroll all the way down, you can see that we have a mask map threshold. And so what I want to do is I want to plug in this guy because we're going to use this as our mask. And I want to make sure that I bring in a histogram scan into this node, because you can see that these have a gradient fall off, and that's going to kind of interfere with the mask map because the mask map should be a binary black and white. So I'm going to use the histogram just to bring the position all the way up. I'm going to make sure I bring the contrast up just in case. And so now we're going to get a binary value for our large rocks. And if we come into our smaller rocks here and we scroll all the way down, you can see that once I start to bring this up, we're going to start to see that some rocks stay and some leave based off of our histogram scan here. And now you can see the problem that we're having is that these rocks are staying in the white areas and they're leaving in the darker areas. And this is going to work inversely to how we wanted it to work. And so what we can do is we can come into our second tile sampler here, and we can simply mask the, invert the mask map, and it's now going to tile everything around where these rocks are. And that's going to be super handy once we start tiling them. And if we move the large rocks, you can see that we're going to be able to move where these smaller rocks are. And so that's super handy, and that's exactly what I was just talking about, as if we line up our nodes correctly and smart, we can pretty much interact with any other node if we need to go back and change things, and it will just smart update. So I'm going to come back into these rocks now. And I also want to mask random a lot of these rocks just so that we're not overladen with all of the rock information that we have. And so those are pretty cool. I'm also going to just decrease the global opacity a little bit so that these rocks aren't super tall. You can see, like, if we crank this back up, we got very tall rocks. That doesn't really look super natural. So I'm going to, well, actually, it looks supernatural. It doesn't look super natural. Man, I'm not good with words today. Anyways, so decrease that a little bit, and so that's looking pretty cool. So now I want to blend these two together just using a height blend so that we can also influence the, I guess, the difference between the height of these rocks. So I'm going to add a height blend, and I want to make sure that our large rocks are the height bottom because they're going to be kind of the foundation that we're working off of. And these smaller rocks are going to be the height top. And so now I'm going to shift steal this. And we're going to be able to see both of our rocks on one material. And right now it looks like our larger rocks are a little bit too small. So I'm going to decrease our height difference here. So that they're looking a little bit more on the same page. And so now we've got a very versatile and robust rock material that we're going to be able to blend in with our snow material going forward. And if I take a look here, we're going to be able to blend these two very nicely. All right, and so we finished creating the two separate height materials or height maps that we want to use to combine for our finalized material. And so we're just going to finish this video off by basically blending the two together and finding a nice kind of ratio and balance between the two. And we're going to do that by creating a height blend. And I want to make sure that I use my rocks in the top here. And I'm going to use the snow in the bottom because we want to have the rocks kind of piercing through the snow, and we can affect how high the rocks are in comparison to our kind of base snow here. And so you can see that once we do that, we're going to get some nice rocks showing through. So I'm going to shift click just to steal that guy, making sure we plug it into the top blended height, not the height mask. And so we're going to get some rocks peeping through our snow here. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to come into the contrast, and I want to just bring that up so that we're not getting some weird gap in between the snow, and it looks like it's actually blending up over top. And so we can also play around with the height offset again to kind of decrease the rock size so they're just peeping out a little bit. Or we can have them kind of protruding through the snow as these large rock forms with some snow that's kind of just fallen in between. So I want to have a little bit of snow peeping over top of our rocks. So I'm going to go to about, let's try 0.3. And that might be a little bit too much snow. So I'm going to try 0.4. And again, that's looking okay, but maybe I want to come back and I want to shift around some of the rocks. So I'm going to come down here, maybe make them a little bit bigger. And I want to move them around a little bit. So I'm going to go back to position random. And that's kind of the effect more that I want. As you saw when I was doing that though, and like we were doing with the kind of snow squalls bending around the snow geometry, the snow doesn't really look like it's reacting to how it would if the rocks were already there. And so I want to go ahead and I want to warp our snow geometry to kind of fit around our rocks. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to add a warp node. That is not at all a warp node, a warp node. And I'm going to plug in the height blend of our rocks here. I'm going to plug that into the intensity of our warp here. And so I want to blur these because right now we're getting very, very weird results. But as soon as we blur these, you can see that the snow starts to push out a little bit from our blur. And the more we blur this, the more it's going to kind of push in a smoother transition, I should say. It's going to push regardless. And so now it kind of looks like the snow is formed around these rocks. And now if I come back and I move these rocks around, you can see the snow starts to kind of conform to that. And now I'm thinking that our height is maybe a little bit too much on the rocks. So I'm going to bring that right down. And actually, I don't mind it with the larger rocks, but I want to make sure that these rocks are not as protruding out as they are. So I'm just going to decrease that a little bit to maybe about 0.2. So now those rocks are not as sharp. And so this is going to conclude the first video where we create our height map. And in the second video, we're going to take a look at finalizing our outputs and finishing the material.